Good evening, colleagues, and it may be good morning for some of you. Welcome all of you to this ISID seminar series. As our usual practice, we will have presentation for about 30 minutes, and each panelist will have about 10 minutes for the discussion. After discussion by panelists is over, the floor will be open for questions and comments. Today we have Dr. Karishma Banga with us to present her paper on the impact of global value chains on the total factor productivity in the Indian manufacturing sector, which was published in the Review of Development Economics last year. We also have a distinguished panel consisting of Professor Devanathan of Institute for Human Development, Dr. Smita Francis, an independent consultant, and Dr. Isha Chawla, consultant at ISID. I will introduce each panelist in more detail when we get into the discussion. So now I will introduce Dr. Karishma. Dr. Karishma Banga is a research fellow in the Digital and Technology Cluster at Institute of Development Studies, which is based at University of Sussex. Her work is focused on international trade, digitalization, and development. Dr. Karishma's ongoing research examines upgrading in global value chains, digitalization and labor markets, and digital trade negotiations, with a focus on development implications, particularly for African and Asian economies. So I would now invite Dr. Karishma to make her presentation.
Thank you, Reggie. Hi, everyone. It's great to be here. Let me just quickly share my screen. Is that visible?
Yes,
it's
yes.
Great. Great. So thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to discuss my recently published paper on global value chains and total factor productivity in Indian manufacturing. And I'm looking forward to hearing your comments and feedback on it and to see how we, which directions we can take this research in and the arising policy implications from this research as well. So I'm really looking forward to that discussion. Just a second. So just a bit of the introduction is that historically, India has lagged behind its comparators in global value chains, despite being very close to factory Asia. And this is a result of a host of factors, including low ability to attract FDI into the manufacturing sector, the manufacturing sector being more domestic market oriented, having low R&D intensity and very stringent labor market regulations and so on. In fact, network products, for which GVCs are the main mode of production, account for only about 10% of India's merchandise exports. And very similar to other developing countries, India, when it does link into value chains, it's usually at the lower end of the manufacturing value chains, providing low value added activities. And as a result, economic upgrading of developing countries in global value chains, including in India, has emerged as a very critical area of research. And so that forms the main sort of crux of this study, where I try to understand or try to empirically examine the impact of global value chains on total factor productivity in Indian manufacturing firms. And in this paper, I'll look at three aspects of value chain participation. So first is whether or not firms are linked into global value chains. The second is the depth, the actual depth of participation or the magnitude of participation. And the third is the type of GVC linkages that a firm has. And this analysis is using an unbalanced panel of Indian manufacturing firms constructed from the firm level data set Prowess, and it has about 14-15 years in that panel. And the main strategy or the empirical strategy of this paper is, it's a two-stage strategy which deploys propensity score matching and system GMM to address the econometric issues of selection and endogeneity, which are quite common when we look at some of these issues. So in the literature, there are several pathways of impact through which value chains can enhance or boost productivity, including a finer international division of labor which leads to specialization of tasks. So country can specialize in the tasks that they are performing and keep that in-house, while offshoring those production activities that they are not that competent in, and that leads to productivity or efficiency gains. Developing countries can also get access to new, cheaper, and a greater diversity of inputs, as well as learn from the technology and knowledge embodied in these inputs, which can create productivity gains and also spillovers. Firms can also, through exporting in these value chains, gain exposure or access to foreign competition or international markets, which creates incentives to innovate and to enhance productivity. Then value chains also lead to organizational changes, as is documented in some studies, through reduction in transaction costs and better coordination activities, and so on. And simultaneously engaging in importing and exporting, or those two-way trade activities in value chains, are also known to create cost complementarities, which can lead to productivity, which can then be reinvested into productivity enhancing activities. So these are several pathways through which value chains can potentially lead or theoretically lead to productivity gains. But as I mentioned before, developing countries tend to link in at the lower value added stages, and therefore looking at economic upgrading in value chains, particularly process upgrading, which is total factor productivity improvements, and product upgrading, which is more about the types of products that are being produced, are quite important in the literature. And this has also been the sort of main focus of my own research in the last few years, where I try to understand these indicators of process and product upgrading in the Indian context. Empirically, there are very clear three strands that have emerged in this literature. So the first set of studies look at are essentially country-level studies that look at input-output data from world input-output data sets or trade and value-added data sets, or there are different organizations bringing out these input-output matrices through which GVC indicators are then constructed, whether that's forward linkages or backward linkages. And these countries then these studies then look at the implications of value chains at the country level on development outcomes like productivity, employment, economic growth, and so on. The second set of studies look at more sort of qualitative analysis using firm and sector level case study data. And here there's an entire literature in the sort of economic sociology category, which finds that governance is a very critical factor when we look at economic upgrading opportunities for developing countries. And governance essentially means how the lead firms are governing, or the kind of power asymmetries that are rising between the supplier firm and the lead firm in these value chains. That will determine the kind of opportunities that developing countries have to upgrade. And simultaneously, another substream of this literature looks at not only external factors like how the lead firm is governing, but also how internal capabilities of the firm, internal technological capabilities of the firm, like its own investments in R&D or its own investments in attracting technologies and so on, shape these upgrading opportunities. And more or less, the consensus seems to be that a particular type of governance chain, which is known as the relational governance chain, offers the most ideal conditions for supplier firms to upgrade. And so these are those chains that are more power symmetrical, and they have more mutual trust and mutual dependence between the buyers and supplier firms. And there is, as a result, better opportunities for firms to upgrade. The third set of studies, which is where this study situates itself, looks at firm level quantitative analysis or studies. That looks at a large amount of this research, mainly focuses on developed countries. So there are lots of studies looking at European firms, particularly Italian firms, in Canadian firms, and so on. And this tries to look at the impact of GVCs on total factor productivity. But this literature is very nascent or very scant for developing countries, but it is gradually emerging. So you have studies emerging for Thailand, Vietnam, and now increasingly India, looking at firm level data and implications of value chains. So, and this is where this research sort of focuses on. And so coming down to my research and the construction of the main variables in the data that is used. So in this research, I use an unbalanced panel, as I mentioned before, constructed from the very rich firm level data set prowess. And this reports, I think overall, there are over 7,000 firms in this panel that report data on trade, productivity, and other control variables. Total factor productivity is estimated using the Levin-Sohan-Petrin approach, with real value added as the output and capital and labor as firms' input. And here, firms' energy inputs are used as the proxy for unobserved productivity shocks. So that's the main Levin-Sohan-Petrin methodology for TFP estimation. To identify GVC firms, I use what is quite standard in the literature, which is looking at those firms that are simultaneously importing intermediate goods and exporting. So this captures the sequential nature of trade within value chains. And it's also very similar to what you see at the country level indicators. And it is also quite standard in the literature, including previously published work, as well as my own study on value chain published earlier last year. To capture the depth of GVC participation or magnitude, I construct a firm level measure of vertical specialization, which essentially looks at the import of raw materials, stores and spares, and capital goods by the firm and the share that is going into exports. And this is normalized using the expenditure on the firm level expenditure. So this vertical specialization index essentially varies between 0 and 1. And it will be 1 if a firm is entirely sourcing all of its inputs from foreign markets and it is selling all of the output into the foreign market. So that would be 1 for the vertical specialization measure. So this essentially, so the greater the vertical specialization measure, the higher the participation in value chains. To identify the type of GVC linkages, again, this is something which is much easier when we look at the developed country data, because they have very rich data sets on that have transaction level data. But given that this is a big data challenge for the case of India, because Prowess does not report transaction level data sets. So I've tried to construct and be a little bit more creative, and this is very much open to criticism, but try to construct a more supplier perspective in understanding the types of linkages that a firm is involved in. So relational value chains are usually the ones that have very complex transactions. Codifiability is low, so it's very difficult for the lead firm to codify the parameters of the product into contracts, which means the codifiability is low. But the supplier competence is high. So that's how you categorize a relational value chain as per the literature. And it is also documented that the skill and the knowledge level in the supplier firm is very strongly related to the nature of tasks in value chain. So if the codifiability is low and the transaction is very complex, then it is most likely the case that the firm will need to have a higher skill level to be able to decodify that transaction and to complete it, to complete that order. So therefore, I use indicators of skill level, so relative skill levels, and relative digital capability or ICT capability in the firm to categorize or to identify those firms that are linked into more power symmetrical relational value chains. So relational firms are identified through a dummy variable, which is equal to 1 if a firm is a high skill and high digital firm. High skill firms are those in which the share of managerial remuneration in total labor compensation is above the median value in the industry. And similarly, high ICT firm is the one in which the ICT index is above the median value for the industry. And this ICT index, or the digital capability index, is constructed using principal component analysis on the share of software assets or technology assets and infrastructure assets that the firm has. So it kind of tells you how digitally capable a firm is to be able to interact then with its lead firms and decodify those transactions. So just very quickly, I wanted to present the summary statistics of the main panel, which includes both GVC and non-GVC firms. And from this table, we see that, so if you look at the GVC firms here, 35% of the firms in the panel from 2000 onwards till 2015 are categorized as GVC firms. So those that are simultaneously importing and exporting and engaged in two-way trade. We observe that the R&D intensity in the panel is on an average quite low. So it's just around 0.18%. Similarly, 7% of the firms in the panel are classified as foreign firms, which is quite standard and in line with what the other studies have also found. And on an average, the foreign equity is about 2% in the panel. And we have firms ranging from, in terms of age, from 1 year to firms that are over 100 years old. The main question that, when we try to analyze this is to look at that at the very outset, are firms that are participating in GVCs different from the ones that are not participating in GVCs? And here I've just conducted some very basic significance tests to understand. And it is very clear that non-GVC firms actually have significantly lower total factor productivity growth, R&D intensity, lower employment, and lower foreign shares. So clearly the characteristics between GVC and non-GVC firms are quite different, which kind of indicates the problem of firms, perhaps self-selecting into these value chains. And I then actually look at this problem to understand whether these firms are self-selecting. And here I've run a simple probit model to look at the probability of a firm to participate in the value chain or in a value chain. And here it is very clear from this table that self-selection is indeed a problem. So we see that firms that have higher productivity are more likely to participate in a value chain. Firms that have more innovative technological capability, so these are the firms that have higher investments in R&D intensity, they are more likely to participate in value chains. Similarly, size and foreign ownership seems to have a positive impact on the probability of a firm to participate. And age seems to have a sort of a threshold effect where older firms are participating more in value chains, but at the same time, after a particular threshold, there's a negative impact of a firm on the probability to participate in a value chain. And here I've controlled for time and industry fixed effects in the last model as well. And we see that these results quite hold. So given that there is a very clear problem of firms self-selecting into the value chains, any result or any model which doesn't deal with this issue is likely to give biased results. And therefore, in line with the literature, I use the main method of propensity score matching to match GVC firms with very similar non-GVC firms. So in this case, entry of a firm into a value chain is what is defined as the treatment variable. And I model the probability of a firm to enter into a value chain, which is a function of, here which you see Z. Z is a function of lagged firm-specific attributes, which are, for instance, lagged productivity, which is going to have an impact on the probability of the firm to enter into value chain in the first place. So this is lagged firm-specific attribute, as well as exogenous current attributes, such as age, as well as industry and time fixed effects. And here I wanted to point out that a firm that has joined a GVC in a particular year is treated as a treatment in that particular year. So for instance, if a firm joins a GVC in 2003, it is treated as a treatment in 2003 and not in 2001 and 2. But once a firm has joined a GVC, in my case, it is treated as a GVC firm throughout the panel. And this is mainly done to avoid conflating the results with multiple entries and exits. So let's say if a firm has joined a GVC in 2005, so 2005 onwards, it is treated as a GVC firm. So I model the probability of each firm to enter into a value chain. And the main P-score specification is such that it has those variables that affect both GVC participation and simultaneously affect productivity. And that is what is standard in studies that do propensity score matching. And then there are a range of tests which are provided or done to ensure that the P-scores are balanced in all blocks and in each year of the panel. Models are also run for each year separately to obtain the probability of the firm to enter the value chain conditional on observables. And then for each year, the GVC firms are matched to very similar non-GVC firms based on those propensity scores and using the kernel matching estimator. And then, as I was mentioning, so I've conducted a range of tests to ensure that the matching is valid. So GVC firms are indeed being matched to non-GVC firms that are very similar, other than their treatment status. So here on the left, I've graphed the common support for treated and non-treated, and we can see that there is significant or enough common support for analysis, and this is just presented for 1 year. So this is done for each year separately. And similarly, the kernel density plots are obtained for each year separately. And this is an example for 2012 to show that indeed after matching, you do see that the density, for the treated and the control is much closer post-matching than before matching. And in addition to this, there are a range of tests, including a PS graph and PS tests, which are conducted to ensure that the matching is valid and it is also quite strong. And then on that match sample, we use system GMM to then also account for issues, econometric issues of endogeneity in the model, because there are bound to be variables such as R&D intensity or GVC participation, which are endogenous. So on the match sample, this is the main econometric model which is run, where the total factor productivity of a particular firm is regressed on lagged total factor productivity. This is done to account for the persistency in productivity and the path dependency in productivity. Then we incorporate current GVC status as well as, so the contemporaneous GVC status as well as lagged GVC status to ensure we're accounting for both sort of lagged and contemporaneous effects. XID is a vector which includes all other variables of control, such as industry concentration, R&D intensity, royalty by sales, age, size, and so on. And then you have the firm, industry, and time fixed effects, respectively. So on this, we run the system GMM model with robust standard errors clustered at the firm level, because the main GVC variable is at the firm level. And the good part about the system GMM indicator is that when external instruments or external valid instruments are absent, system GMM uses internal instruments to run the model. And system GMM particularly simultaneously runs the model in levels as well as in first differences. And it uses the lagged values of levels as instruments for the first differences and vice versa. And then again, a range of tests are included, such as this, this traditional Hansen's test and the Erlano and Bonds test, to ensure that there is no autocorrelation and the instruments are exogenous and valid. Coming to the main results. So here we look at the impact of linking into value chains on total factor productivity. And the first two models present results on the unmatched panel, while the last three models present results on the matched panel using propensity score matching and system GMM. So here we know that lagged productivity across the models has a significant and positive impact on linking into on current productivity. And that kind of just renders more support and validity to use system GMM, because there is clearly a persistency in productivity. We also find a positive and significant impact of age. So the older the firms are, they're more productive. We find a negative impact of leverage on firm productivity. So debt-ridden firms clearly struggle a lot to capitalize on new opportunities to boost their productivity. So therefore, we see the negative impact. And again, this is quite in line with findings from other studies as well. Liquidity is found to have a positive and significant impact on firm productivity. And here, although because of the constraint in space, I was not able to present all of the control variables, but essentially these models control for foreign status, industry concentration in R&D intensity, foreign shares, time fixed effects, industry fixed effects as well. And so in the longer version of the paper, the published version, you can look at these coefficients as well. But across all the models, we find that the coefficient on the GVC firm dummy is positive and significant, although the significance has reduced when we look at the matched panel. But this clearly indicates that linking into GVCs can statistically significantly boost firm productivity, controlling for all other firm variables, as you can see. In the second set of regressions here, we restrict the analysis to those firms that are participating in GVC. So these are just the panel of GVC firms. And we try to understand, as I was mentioning before, whether depth of GVC participation also matters. And here again, models 1 and 2 present sort of the lower and the higher estimates for the system GMM estimators. So the system GMM estimation is valid if it lies between essentially the OLS and the fixed effects estimates for lagged productivity, which we can see clearly is the case, again, rendering support to the validity of these estimations. And then again, throughout the models, we can see that vertical specialization has a positive and significant impact on firm productivity, indicating that even once linked, the magnitude of participation can significantly boost firm productivity. And like before, we also find a positive impact of age for the sample of GVC firms, as well as liquidity. And these regressions, again, control for industry concentration, leverage, R&D intensity, as well as time and industry fixed effects. One of the results that I wanted to, highlight here was that we particularly find, a positive and significant impact for the case of network product industries. So here I've just restricted the sample in Model A to those industries like electronics or computers and optical and vehicles, which are, the network product industries that usually use GVCs as the dominant form of production. And we see that, it is statistically more significant in the case of network product industries as opposed to non-network industries. In the third set of results, here we look at the type of participation and its impact on firm productivity. And here I've used those dummy variables like I was mentioning before. And here we see that again, across the models, high ICT and high skilled firms. So these are those firms that are more likely engaged in relational governance structures. So they have a positive and significant impact on firm productivity as opposed to firms that have low ICT or low digital capability index. So this clearly indicates that, firms that are linked into relational governance structures are likely to have higher productivity than firms linked in other sort of governance structures. And interestingly, we see that this impact is significantly higher in the case of non-network product industries. So these includes industries like leather and leather products, wearing apparels, footwear, and so on. So these are the non-network product industries, and particularly in this case, the productivity gains from digitalization and skills is actually quite significant, both economically and statistically. And here we also run samples, and this domestic firm sample is, we just remove all the foreign firms. This is just restricted to the domestic firm samples, and we see that the results still hold. In the longer version of the paper, I've conducted actually a range of robustness checks to ensure that the results are not sensitive to a particular measurement technique or a particular variable. So we know that linking into value chains can enhance export survival of a firm, or can can impact firm entry and exit. So I've also constructed a balance panel for the period and reran all the regressions on a balance panel. And again, the results all hold. And the coefficient of the GVC firm dummy in the balance panel lies between 0.32 to 0.39. Indicating that linking into GVCs can boost firm productivity by roughly 30 to 39% on an average, which is also again similar to some of the studies on other developing countries. The results are also robust to the use of bootstrap standard errors, which is quite common after propensity score matching, as well as standard errors clusters on firms and industries. I've ran regressions using different lags of the endogenous variables to ensure that they're not sensitive to a particular lag in the case of system GMM. I've also used different methodologies of one-step system GMM, OLS, and fixed effects to ensure robustness, as well as alternate ways of measuring GVC integration and endogenous variables, as well as robust to the use of interaction and addition of other control variables. So while this does, give support and give confidence in terms of the validity of the results, I think there are three important caveats that need to be mentioned here. The first caveat is that it would be interesting to see if the results still hold using a stricter identification strategy for GVC firms, right? So those firms that are not only simultaneously exporting and importing, but perhaps also has, let's say, an export certification, or also have, a technology certification, for instance. I think it would be interesting to see, if you have a stricter identification strategy, whether the results will hold. Second, the results in GVC governance need to be interpreted quite carefully because, as I mentioned before, Indian firms or prowess does not have transaction level data. So it's more from a supplier perspective. So it needs to be interpreted with a lot of caution. And it would be very interesting to see if there are other ways of capturing GVC governance using transaction level or matching transaction level data with firm level data. I know there are a couple of private databases on this. And the third is, the lack of export destination data in prowess, because we're increasingly finding that export destinations or the geography of GVCs, play a very important role in terms of productivity gains as well. So how a firm is, how much productivity gains it is witnessing from exporting to China versus US. I think that's a very interesting comparison, which I'm not able to account for in this analysis. Nonetheless, the results clearly indicate that GVCs are still a significant driver of total factor productivity in the case of Indian manufacturing firms. Once linked, GVC embeddedness can also have a significant and positive impact on firm productivity, particularly in the case of network product industries like computer and electronics and so on. Productivity growth is on average 20% higher in GVC firms that link with higher digital capabilities and skill capabilities. So this clearly, makes a case for investments into digitalization and skills development as well. And we found a positive impact for firm age, liquidity, and size, and a negative impact of firm leverage on firm productivity. And to me, what's the most interesting is to then contextualize these results and what's really happening to kind of understand the realities of India's GVC participation given the current scenario that we are facing today. And it's very clear that there are new opportunities for India to sort of refocus its attention on value chains. So we know that, with the COVID-19 pandemic and the US-China tensions, there has been sort of a wave of MNC operations shifting away or reallocating away from China. And so this kind of realignment, does present new opportunities for India, particularly in the textile and wearing apparels and leather footwear sector, where it could potentially serve as an alternative to China for the US, as a key exporter to the US. Similarly, we see that there is a rise of South-South trade, or what is known as the polycentric trade pattern, where the global South is now emerging as a key sort of consumption market. And as a result of the rise of the middle class, as well as a rise of lead firms like Huawei in China or Mahindra in India, right? So we see that, there is a lot of India's trade as well. So some of my own work documents that India's manufacturing trade is very gradually shifting away from the global north to the global south, which can present new opportunities, in this context as well. At the same time, there are new challenges. And one of the biggest challenges that my own work sees is the rise of digitalization, automation, and Industry 4.0 in the global north. And we see that value chains are becoming increasingly digitalized end to end, right? And this could have potentially lead to increased reshoring or limited offshoring of manufacturing activities to developing countries in the future, or perhaps just lead to a shortening of value chains. And all of this could adversely impact, particularly the less digitally integrated Indian manufacturing firms. So taken together, I think, in terms of the policy space, I think, of course, there is space for the more horizontal policies around trade facilitation, improving customs and logistics and business environment and so on. But there is also a need to target policies around building firm level technological capabilities and R&D intensity, as well as skills development and digital capabilities at the firm level. And as a result, this is going to create particularly productivity gains in the labor intensive value chains. And this can then lead to productivity increases and subsequently job creation linked to those productivity gains. Similarly, there's need for policies to increase the domestic value addition in the within the Indian economy, and to create those much needed links between the foreign firms and the domestic suppliers, again, to realize the larger scale sort of employment gains from productivity growth. There's a need to attract FDI and to facilitate technological upgrading and spillovers, which has traditionally been the main challenge for why India has kind of missed out on the value chain boat. And then there is space for policies to offer support to firms through incentives and subsidies, particularly in deploying digital services, right? So looking at digital servicification of Indian manufacturing can have a significant impact on export competitiveness and productivity of the Indian firms. And lastly, as I was mentioning, the rise of South-South trade presents a unique opportunity for India to develop its own value chain through outward FDI ventures and to sort of serve as the growth pole in the region as well. So I think it'll be very interesting to see how those shifts take place as things change. So I think with that, I'm at the end of the presentation. I just wanted to quickly highlight that some of my forthcoming research, tackles some of these issues. So I'm working right now, for instance, with the Asian Development Bank, looking at technology, value chains, and structural transformation in Bangladesh. And I'm looking at digitalization and structural transformation in low and middle income countries, including India, with UNU wider. And particularly in the case of the Indian context, I'm looking at how digitalization is changing sort of Indian garments manufacturing value chains. So that's also something which I hope to update you on in the near future. So yes, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Karishma. Your study basically brings out that participation in GVCs improves the TFP in the manufacturing sector. And your study also brings out a number of interesting policy inferences, especially in the context of supply chain diversification strategies followed by foreign countries and foreign firms. It's very interesting. So now let us hear from our panelists. Hello, Professor Devanathan.
Hello, yes.
Yeah. So Professor Devanathan doesn't need an introduction for this group. He is a visiting professor at Institute for Human Development. He is also a visiting research fellow at Duke University. So currently, he is the coordinator of the IDRC-sponsored South Asia Research Network on Employment and Social Protection. His research interests include labor in global production, gender relations, and the development issues of indigenous peoples. Devanathan, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Just a correction, you have a little older CV. I'm not with Duke University anymore. I'm now as a visiting scholar at the New School for Social Research in New York, along with being a visiting professor at IHD. Thanks to Karishma for a very interesting paper. I can't say anything about the econometrics, that's not my area. But yes, the basic conclusion that you have is, well, intuitively also one would accept it, that there is a higher growth of TFP in GVC-related firms rather than as compared to those that are not with GVCs. But I would like to take up the meaning of your conclusion, because I think we need to go beyond that, which is an empirical matter that you have found. We need to go beyond that to see what does it mean in terms of relations in value chains. First, the point is that what happens to the margins? What are the firm margins like when they increase their TFP? Does the margin go up? Particularly because, as you point out, these are really process improvements which increase the TFP. And so do the profit margins of these firms go up? I presume Provest Data has a way of calculating that. You can do that. Because what we found in the study which we did, which came out in the book on reverse subsidies and global monopsony capitalism just early last year in 2022, is that even where there was an increase in investments and in productivity, this productivity increases were actually captured by the lead firms. The results of the productivity increase were captured by the lead firms, while the margins did not really change for the suppliers. What did change for the suppliers was the volume of business they did. Generally, those that had increased their productivity through investments of various kinds were able to get larger and more secure orders. So the volume of their business and therefore the volume of their profits also went up, but we did not find a real change in the rates of profits that they earned. It remained around that 10 to 12%, which we find across these supplying firms. So I think it's necessary to look at who captures it. Now, this goes back to a point that, or a term that you used, that these are low value added segments. Now, the point is, I don't agree with the use of the term value added segments. The point is these are low value capturing segments. These are segments that get a low share or a low profit, not just a share, but even a low profit rate in the value chain. Now, had these firms been actually manufacturing departments of the lead firms, then we would not say that these are low value added. We would say the value addition is across all of the departments together. And we would not separate and say that this is a low value added department, that's a high value added department. The value addition would be at the level of the product and the firm as a whole. But this is exactly where the GVC splintering of production comes in, that it is able to splinter and therefore to pass off to the global south those segments that have a use of commonly available or knowledge, commoditized knowledge, which like the knowledge of manufacture, and therefore they suffer in terms of their bargaining power in the global value chain. You refer to relational firms where there's a kind of evenness in the bargaining power. But the point is that many of the firms that you would have studied in the labor, particularly in the garments and leather and such labor-intensive industries, would be not of a relational type, but would be what in the governance literature is called of the captive type. That means they use technology that is commoditized. They use knowledge that is in the commons. They don't use intellectual property rights protected knowledge, nor do they have much tacit knowledge. It's all very explicit. It's all very formally put down. So therefore, their bargaining power is very low. And that's why we call this a monopsony relationship also, because, there are huge numbers of these suppliers. A company like M&S or Zara, they have about 1,000 suppliers each, which is very many more than they need to supply, to produce all the products that they put on their shop floor. Why do they have so many? Because they want to utilize the competition among the suppliers. So therefore, it is this ease of entry because of commoditized knowledge, because of therefore, which gives them a low bargaining power, which means that the buyers, the lead firms, are able to capture any gains in productivity which are made by these firms. So in fact, somebody then asked me, so why do they make these gains? Why do they make this investment? The point is they are able to increase their volume. So the volume of profits goes up, but not the rate of profit. There's really no difference. It would be very interesting if you could see over, because you have a time series, what has happened to the rates of profit of these firms in their global product, what is the term you use? Network products. How did it change? Despite that, there's a 20% higher growth of TFP. So what happened to the profit rates? Were they able to capture that increase in TFP, or was it captured by the buyers? I think that's an important point, which I hope your prowess data should be able to allow you to answer, and would make a very interesting, follow-up paper to what you have done so far. Then a few points on some of the points you made, which were one was very surprising. You see, we look at entry into value chains as really not a matter of FDI. Foreign firms don't invest in the suppliers in Tirupur. They don't put their capital into those firms, or even into the bigger firms like Shahi, etc. They don't put their capital into them, but they are part of the value chain. So this is exactly a different form of relationship of a production system that doesn't depend on FDI. So it's quite different from that. So I think that it needs to be clear what is the role of FDI in what you looked at. Then you make 2 points about the change in the value chain that are now happening. I think there's one part of it. I agree that there's a kind of change in these value chains because of the strategic reordering of the world. But there is one part of it which seems to be missed in what you put. And that is there's not so much reshoring or onshoring as what Janet Yellen, who is the Secretary of the Treasury of the US, called friend-shoring. So they're moving into friendly locations. Therefore, the movement out of China, because clearly there is the biggest power conflict is between the US and China. So they would like to reduce their dependence on China. The Japanese and the South Koreans are also doing the same. And so they're not just moving anywhere, they're moving to those which are part of their strategic alliance, which of course is where a chance for India comes in, because it is part of the Quad. There's no doubt about it. It is part of the Quad, which is, US, Japan, Australia, India, and is definitely part of that alliance, which is likely to benefit from from foreign firms leaving, or rather the lead firms leaving suppliers in China and trying to move to other places. I mean, they're moving to Vietnam, to Indonesia, to Bangladesh, but India in the lower sections in terms of in the labor intensive areas like garments and leather is not really getting much of that benefit. It's only getting it in terms of the medium technology areas like the assembly of smartphones and electronics, but it's not really benefiting in that first one, where it can, provided it gets its policy right. The last point you made about the possibility for Indian firms to develop their own value chains, yes, this is very much so. But here I must point out that we need to move from one kind of economy or one kind of firm to another. We need to move from firms that utilize commoditized knowledge or knowledge in the commons to firms that are able to create knowledge which they can monopolize in terms of intellectual property rights, the firms, or in terms of brands, etc. So the Indian ICT firms have done a little bit of that, though they've not really done too much. But you will see that their margin, their rates, today the Infosys annual accounts came out, and they said their margin is about, operating margin is about 20%. Now, when you look at, now that's still very low when you consider IBM or Accenture with whom they are competing. I mean, the revenue per employee of TCS and Infosys is around $50,000 per employee, while for IBM and Accenture, it's at about $150,000 to $200,000 per employee, which tells you exactly where they are different in the section of the value chain in which they are operating. We are much more in the middle to lower sections and much less in the upper sections of that value capturing chains. So if you want to actually, if India needs to develop their own value chains, they will have to develop lead firms which have the monopolized knowledge, which they're able to protect in one way or the other. And that alone, in the capitalist world as we have it today, in this global capitalist world, would enable India to develop its own value chains. So these are just a few points which you might consider in carrying forward your work. Once again, congratulations on a very, well, I can't say anything about the econometrics, but I presume you had very good guides. I saw the names of Kunal Sen and Goldar, and obviously they would have made sure that you got all of this correct. So again, finally, congratulations. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Devanathan. So now we will turn to Dr. Smita Francis. Dr. Smita is an independent consultant focusing on issues related to international trade, investment, and industrial policies for more than 2 decades. She has highlighted rarely analyzed interfaces between India's trade and FDI liberalization and the perverse incentives they have often generated for domestic innovation and manufacturing, especially in the context of the Indian electronics industry. Her book, Industrial Policy Challenges for India, Global Value Chains and Free Trade Agreements, published by Routledge, came out in 2019. Dr. Smita had a long association with ISID until recently. In the past, she had worked with the Economic Research Foundation and RIS. She has also been a visiting faculty at the South Asian University and Ambedkar University, New Delhi. Smita, you have the floor.
Thank you, Reggie. And thank you for inviting me to be a part of this discussion. I would wait. I'm sorry, it's just a second. What happened? I'm so sorry. Am I still?
No, we cannot see your PPT.
No.
I hope you are uploading PPT.
But what, I am visible?
You are visible, but it's your PPT is not.
You are visible, but the PPT is not visible.
But my Zoom is just not happening. So let me just, talk without sharing the screen. Basically, yes, Karishma's paper, Karishma, you've done a very rigorous econometric analysis, and I congratulate you on that. And but I would basically highlight some conceptual issues, which one of which Professor Devanathan very briefly alluded to. So let me get to it in a little more detail. So two of the conceptual issues which I want to highlight are about the definition of the GVC participation and GVC embeddedness that you're using. And the second one is about the relevance of the productivity estimates for deriving development implications of GVC participation in the context of developing countries. So, the definition of GVC firms you've used is focusing on how a firm, GVC firms, engage in simultaneous importing of intermediates and exporting of intermediate or final goods at a given point of time. And non-GVC firms are either those conduct one-way trade, so either only imports or only exports, and serve only the domestic market. So basically, I would like to point out that from what my own research in the Indian electronics industry has pointed out, which was part of an ICSR research program carried out at ISID in recent years, that the focus on simultaneous imports and exports or two-way trade at the firm level fails to incorporate the more complex network relations within GVCs already established in the literature. So we know that lead firms change their organizational structures and strategies for generating and maintaining their core competencies in response to highly complex factors, combination of factors, including technological change as well as policy changes in different countries, including trade and investment liberalization, incentives, tax policy changes, and a whole lot of factors. So the extent of functional and geographic fragmentation by lead firms have led GVCs to grow in network complexity, which has been identified in the literature. So there have been very different types of relationships between lead firms and other value chain participants, including foreign affiliates in developing countries. So dense networks have emerged that involve a combination of arm's length market transactions, which are interfirm, internalized transactions, which are intra-firm or what we call as related party transactions, and those in between, involving both, some extent of interfirm and internalized, which has led to an increase in both vertical and horizontal integration along value chains. And these involve different degrees of lead firms, investment, technical support, including equity participation, subcontracting, and control in network firms. So when I was looking at the electronics firms, so the kind of typology I developed was, I thought I can, discuss here, because these are some of the forms of developing country firms' engagement in GVCs. When we are looking at how firms can enter into GVCs, it can be as a part of, as a kind of FDI itself, or even domestic firms can enter into GVCs, as suppliers, as you have mentioned. So one can be the export platform strategy of foreign affiliates established in the developing country, which is basically vertical or efficiency seeking FDI. In this case, they will be importing to export if it's an export platform strategy. Now, there's a second group will be a domestic market seeking strategy of foreign firms established in a developing country, which is horizontal FDI, in which case the importing will be only for domestic sales. So I'm saying that an example would be Samsung India, in fact, Samsung in India, Apple India, and all would be excluded if you're looking at only at the first type of firms, where it's an export platform strategy or vertical FDI or efficiency seeking FDI. because these firms were completely domestic because of the fact of India's FTAs with ASEAN and Korea, especially after ASEAN FTA was signed. These firms were basically utilizing their network partners in other partner countries to import into India, but for the domestic market. So these were not actually registering exports at that time. The exports which are recorded in the annual reports, if you look at the annual reports or Provis data, I'm not sure whether they give, they don't give the breakup. So if you look at the annual reports, you will see that whatever 5 to 10% of exports they were having, or foreign exchange earnings they were having, were from services exports. So, but can we say that Samsung India and Apple India were not part of the GVCs? Obviously not. So the other examples I can give is, similarly, Apple's local subcontractors, which were themselves foreign affiliates, which that Foxconn and Wistron and all, they were importing for domestic sales before Apple started exporting iPhones from India. So again, clearly Foxconn and Wistron, which are FDI firms, were integral parts of Apple's GVCs, but their involvement would be excluded in this definition which you're using, because they show only one-way trade, and again, no exports, it will be only imports. Now, a third kind of developing country firms engagement will be, we should also look at direct entry into export markets by domestic firms. I'm sorry, the slide sharing is not working out. So direct entry into export markets by domestic firms, which may be importing to export, but imports may be low or insignificant for technologically advanced domestic firms. And mind you, there are technologically advanced domestic firms here, which are importing less, which are less import intensive, and they will also get excluded in analysis focusing on two-way trade or import intensity if we are putting some benchmarks there. Yet another form of entry of domestic firms would be indirect entry of domestic firms into export markets through subcontracting to foreign firms established abroad. But in this case, they're again importing to export. So you will, the two-way trade which you're looking at through the vertical specialization will capture this. Now, a fifth type of entry of developing country firms into GVCs will be indirect entry of domestic firms through subcontracting to foreign firms established locally for domestic sales. Now, these are the kind of firms, for example, Samsung India's domestic subcontractors like Dixon Technologies, which was engaged in its GVC for domestic sales to India until Samsung India started exporting in around 2017-18. So here again, it's import for domestic sales. There is no exports, and therefore there is only one-way trade. Now, even the Jeffrey and Sturgeon's paper, 2005 paper, which you've utilized, they in fact state that recognizing the importance of transaction costs need not lead to the conclusion that complex and tightly controlled production systems always result in vertical integration. So we have come actually, given the complexity of network relationships, which have been identified, and actually, the FDI literature, even within the FDI literature, if you're talking of, if we want to consider only FDI-led GVC participation, even that has evolved to deal with the complexities in value chains. For example, Yeaple's paper in 2003 talks about complex FDI. Richard Baldwin and Anthony Venable's 2010 paper argued that production disintegration processes are complex mixtures of both snakes and spiders, where snakes is the linear process and spiders are, different limb and with parts from different sources coming together at one place for assembly. So it's a combination of both the vertical, again, to show that it's a combination of both vertical and horizontal integration. And another paper by Baldwin and Okuba then talked about networked FDI, which comes closest to, because again, it shows that vertical and horizontal, the differentiation between vertical and horizontal FDI have been increasingly blurred because of the complex networks which have come about in the production fragmentation processes by lead firms. So but even the networked FDI, mind you, doesn't capture the participation of domestic firms in different forms. And just like as I was saying, it can be for imports for domestic sales. So
Smita? Can you wind up in 1 or 2 minutes?
Yeah. So while we cannot accommodate the full possible range of heterogeneity of the GVC structures, so if we stick with this partial definition, it would be better to qualify the results and policy interpretations accordingly. So another suggestion I have is that forms of GVC engagement are not the same across sectors. So rather than this, across industry study, industry-specific analysis may be more useful, especially from a policy point of view. Now, the other question I would like to, relatedly, I just wanted to mention, so the problem with adopting importing to export to estimate the vertical specialization will capture only one type of, specific type of GVC participation. In that sense, it underestimates, it may be underestimating the participation by Indian firms, manufacturing firms. But at the same time, because as I mentioned that many of them are importing for domestic sales, and it is showing, and those firms are excluded, the import intensity of those firms are getting excluded. And so the estimations that you have carried out may also be overestimating the benefits from GVC participation. The exclusion of import-dependent domestic-oriented firms with little or no exports. So that underestimates GVC engagement. Now, for the same reasons, it will also overestimate the benefit from GVC participation, as I said. So in a sense, this can be seen to be the reason why later studies using, the trade in value added began looking at the composition of final demand and included foreign value added in final demand along with foreign value added in exports, or import intensity in exports and domestic value added in exports, domestic backward integration and forward integration to estimate the degree of GVC participation. The last point I would like to raise, the second issue I would like to raise is, so how was the strength of, in the context of overestimating benefits, what role, which is, I just would like to some clarification because I wasn't able to understand whether the removal of negative values of value added in the data cleaning phase, how does it affect the robustness of the manufacturing sector aggregate level results which you are presenting? Or have you, like, I'm wondering, what do even negative values for sales and output mean in this context when we are looking at benefits from GVC participation? So the other part is the question about the relevance of the productivity estimate, because how do we correlate the findings of this higher productivity at the firm level with empirical evidence from the larger literature on the performance of the manufacturing sector in India, where there's been the stagnant share of manufacturing value-added share in GDP during the period covered by the study. And if we look at foreign invested firms, there have been large net foreign exchange outflows from FDI firms. There have been a number of in-depth studies carried out at ISID itself and even outside, even by other scholars. And the several studies for India using the trade in value-added database, which shows a decline in value-added for the major manufacturing industries, some of which you have mentioned, which are included in your study. So the question is, how does the productivity increase in productivity, which has been shown in your results, how do they correlate, and how can we reconcile that with the larger literature, larger empirical evidence on the manufacturing sector, and when we know that an increase in domestic value addition is required for these productivity gains to be internalized within the national economy. So I'll stop there. I hope this can be, incorporated into this kind of, insights can be incorporated into your future research. Thank you.
Thank you, Smita. Next in our panel is Dr. Isha Chawla. She is a consultant at ISID, joined last year. Until recently, she worked as an associate professor at Lakshmi Bai College under University of Delhi, where she taught primarily mathematical economics and statistical methods. So she has also taught at other colleges under Delhi University. She is the recipient of Exim Bank of India's International Economic Research Annual Award for the year 2016. Her research interests include foreign direct investment, firm productivity, and global value chains. Dr. Isha.
Thank you, Reggie. It was a pleasure to go through your paper, Karishma. I have some comments and suggestions. I'll try to go as fast as possible and in the order in which the sections in your paper are there. So the first thing is that I feel that GBC participation at the firm level is not captured as well as it is at the country or at the sectoral level. So a brief outline of what GBC participation in terms of forward and backward linkages mean would help the reader get some intuition into what GVCs are, especially in terms of the forward linkages. When we say that it is domestic value added, which is embodied in foreign exports as share of gross exports. Now, this does not come in anywhere in the GVC participation at the firm level, whatever definition is being taken. Then the next thing is that in your literature review on the developing economies, I think that the literature reviews, because the comments which I'm giving, they are just in the same order as your section. Some are minor, some are major. I'm just putting it as quickly as possible. So in the literature review on the developing economies, I think that the mechanisms and the policies would be useful to refer to for India also, but that literature review is slightly telegraphic. So if you can, expand on that in your future exercises, especially if you can go through the work by Shashidharan and Reddy and the recent work by Professor Goldar with Ananta. Then when we come to the data and construction of variables, I have some concerns. For instance, when you're looking at the small firm, medium firm, and the big firm, you are taking the labor, as the criteria for working out the dummies. So that can be a concern, especially because you know that you have already written that Provis does not give the employment data for a large number of firms. That is itself being estimated using the SI data. So using that again to construct a dummy can be a concern, especially when most of the researchers are using log assets or log sales to find out these dummies. Then when you look at the labor estimation, you are saying that since the uniform wage rate has been criticized, by a large number of researchers, you are referring to Golda Sir's paper about the 10% premium for foreign firms. So I think you can refer to some other recent literature also in which the productivity premiums are being worked out, or you may yourself use some recent Provis data to work out the productivity premium for foreign firms, government firms, vis-a-vis the private Indian firms. Then since productivity is your major variable, the focal point of your research, I think some robustness regarding the TFP estimation is very much required, especially since you use a value-added production function. Now, it is well known in the literature that a value-added bias results from using a value-added production function, especially in the context of studies which link foreign productivity and foreign involvement. You can refer to the studies by Gandhi, Navarro, and Rivers, in which they highlight, in addition to the transmission bias, how a value-added bias can lead to, they can give you more productivity for the foreign involved firms. So it is always desirable to compare the results of the value-added production function with that of the revenue or the gross output production function. Then when it comes to the value-added production function itself, I'm not sure why, services have not been considered here. Maybe you have done previously, because I was referring to your paper with Golda Sir, I think the paper which has come in 2020, in which you have explicitly given services. So is it miss here? And you have actually considered services, because services is an important input, the heterogeneous services which go into the intermediate input category, and if that has not been accounted of, then how your TFP estimates may not be as accurate as possible. Then when it comes to the data that you have, the variables that you are giving, it would have been better if you could have given the correlation between the variables. Also at the industry level, though you have given HHI, but it would help if you could give some domino or peer effects or some horizontal spillovers of the GVC firms, because GVC firms would be in clusters. So if being a GVC firm has an impact on other firms in the industry, and even if you could give some names of the firms which are prominent in GVCs in the Indian context, because the reader would very much want to know what those firms are. Then when it comes to your descriptive statistics, I have a slight query here, because you are right that the R&D intensity for all firms in the sample, the minimum value is 0 and the R&D maximum value is 96.8. And for the GVC firms, the minimum value is 0 and the maximum value is 209.38. Now this is the R&D intensity, not the absolute value of R&D. And likewise in TFP, I understand that you are taking the log values, but you have not mentioned that in your descriptive statistics, and that can cause confusion, because you write that the minimum value of TFP is 0 and the maximum is 2.26. Now in any distribution, it would be, for instance, -4 to 4. That would be the range in which the log TFP could lie. It would have helped greatly if you would have shown the kernel distribution for TFP for firms, the different degrees of foreign involvement. And when you are comparing, for instance, in your PPT, you have shown the t-test. In the paper, it is not there. So if you show the t-test, you have written in the note to the table that the t-test, so that is a test for the difference in the means. So that is not capturing all the moments. So it is more robust to use the Kolmogorov-Smirnov test for that. Then when you come to the productivity growth estimates, you say that leather industry has the second highest productivity growth. So I really suggest that if it is possible for you to refer to some other studies which have been done in India, and are you getting comparable results, or I mean, it would help if you could give some comparison with other studies, maybe Clem's data or some other researchers have used. Then for the GVC's identification, now I understand that there are several methods that have been used. For instance, you have used the import of intermediates, but some studies are also using the OFDI. Is it going to help if you include OFDI or not? For instance, Devanathan sir has a different view. Maybe you can, just think over this, that how consideration of OFDI may help in your analysis. Then when it comes to the econometric model, I am not sure if this is again a typing mistake, but you have referred to firm fixed effects. Now, firm fixed effects and industry fixed effects, I don't know how the firm fixed effects can be captured when the industry fixed effects are already there. And I think it would have helped the reader greatly if you would have explained the firm fixed effects and the industry fixed effects. That is, what is the interpretation that you get from that? Then another concern is that you have used the propensity score matching. Yes, you have used the system GMM that comes at the second stage. So I would like to know why the PSM difference in difference methodology could not have been used in this case, because that would have controlled for the firm invariant effects in any case. And that is the methodology which has been used by a large number of researchers which are using firm level data for GVC impact. And when you say that you are matching at the year level, right? Now you say that since the industry dummies have been included, so therefore it is going to increase the probability of getting a match from the same industry, but I really have my concerns over there, because you cannot rule out if a firm from the leather industry has been matched with that from the motor vehicles industry just by keeping industry dummies. So you could refer to studies which are using the industry year matching directly. They are using, for instance, Arnold and Jaworczyk, or you could even look at Golda sir's recent paper with Anandita, in which he has developed another alternative methodology for overcoming this problem. Then next is, when it comes to PSM, yes, a number of researchers are adopting PSM, but it would help to go through King and Nielsen 2019 paper that why propensity scores should not be used for matching. Right? For instance, here I just quote from my own paper, the same lines, because I also got a comment from a reviewer and I had to incorporate this aspect in my study. So this is that existing literature suggests that standard PSM suffers from issues of imbalance, inefficiency, model dependency, and bias. This is King and Nielsen. So results of balancing tests, you can refer to your balancing test results to signify that the propensity score specification is effective in accounting for factors that determine selection into treatment and match balance. That is, you have to show through your results that yes, PSM is holding good for your work. Then I have another concern, which is when you say that the results hold good for the contemporaneous effects of joining GVCs, but the coefficients on lagged values of GVC firms are not significant. I really don't know. I really don't know how to interpret this, because if you're looking at only the static effects are coming in, is it through the model that you are using? Because you are not getting what would be the effect of entering GVC today, tomorrow, day after, 1 year today, means T plus 1, T plus 2, and so on. So those effects are not being captured. So your contemporaneous results, fine. Yes, some other developing country studies have shown that these effects are there, but we want to know what will happen tomorrow and day after also, whether the dynamic effects are there for the policy support that you are yourself suggesting. So this is one concern. And I think some rationale for the non-network industries also that could be expanded on would help. So I stop here. Thank you very much, Karishma and Reggie and all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Dr. Isha.
Thank you.
Dr. Karishma, if you would like to respond to the comments, you can do.
Yeah. So thank you, everyone. I think thank you to the panelists. I think that's a lot of food for thought and some very interesting feedback and comments that, of course, help me as I work more on this topic around productivity in the near future as well. So lots of interesting, I think, points, and hopefully I will be able to address at least some of the points. So I think just, very quickly, and I won't be able to address everything, but I think just very quickly picking up on a couple of points that were mentioned. So I think Professor Nathan was mentioning around, I think, margins, like profit margins. So yeah, I completely agree with that point that we are only looking at sort of productivity increases, and it doesn't necessarily make any comment on exactly where that value added or those profit margins are going. There is more work that I've done. So productivity upgrading is sort of the first entry into the value chain. And then the next sort of upgrading is product sophistication, where you look at the kind of products you're producing. And I've published 2 papers recently after this on product sophistication, showing that how value chains are impacting and have a positive and significant impact on the product sophistication basket of a particular firm. So it goes to show that productivity gains are being realized at the firm level, and product sophistication gains are also being realized where firms are able to move their production and concentrate it towards more sophisticated products in their own basket, or move into entirely new and sophisticated products, right? So for instance, from leather footwear to leather upholstery in a car. Again, that doesn't really comment on the profit margin. So I agree. I think the next step would be to actually look at whether even those product sophistication gains are then being realized, actually realized by the firm in terms of the profit. So I take that point around productivity leading to perhaps increase in the volume, but not so much as the markup. So that's an interesting point. And I think more work on this is definitely needed. And Pravas does report information on profits as well. So I think that's a very good point of future research as well. Then I think Dr. Smith also mentioned, and I think overall, of course, I think there's a lot of debate and discussion around the definitions of value chains and the complex nature of networks, and also the role of FDI into value chains, and whether to use sort of Jeffries typology, where you're looking at arm lengths, but you also have the vertical integration, and then you have the 3 network structures in the middle, which is a mixture of trade and FDI. And of course, I agree with some of the definitions that are being used, but I've also received criticism that like this definition is actually too broad, like it is covering too much. And in fact, actually GVC firms, you have to, include certifications, for instance, to actually then so I mean, people, lots of different scholars in different fields have very specific definitions of value chain. So I don't think would be able to address all of them, but I do take the very important point mentioned by Dr. Smita, that there is a lot of heterogeneity in the GVC structure as well. So I've noted that down. And for me, I think it's a very interesting point to look at as you mentioned, those firms that are importing for domestic sales only, and how we can incorporate that particular point, perhaps through FDI, but how we can incorporate that into the analysis. So I've taken that point on board to look at some of these issues in the next, whatever next paper that I do. Then around the point of, I think, developing, again, I'm going in no particular order, but around the point of developing own value chains and sort of leveraging South-South trade. So I agree that there is not a lot of this. I was reading about it. There's this whole, the new concept around friendshoring, that it might not necessarily be India that is benefiting per se from the reallocation of MNCs away from China. But yeah, I think there are definitely new opportunities to be realized there in terms of how India can develop its own value chains, not necessarily only through outward FDI, but also necessarily looking at where it can more competitively source intermediate inputs from and sort of form its own intermediate value chains. And then, as mentioned by Professor Nathan, look at how to build sort of that R&D intensity to capture profit margins and those intellectual property rights issues around that. A whole, different sort of topic altogether, but some of my recent work looking at manufacturing, recent blog looking at manufacturing and service value chains in India kind of depicts that shift. And it's interesting, I think it is moving away from Europe and US, if I remember correctly, and actually towards China. So India sort of final demand in manufacturing and services. So that's an interesting, I think, shift to be analyzed further. Then I think on Dr. Isha's points, I think some of some of the comments were very useful, and I'll definitely take them on board. Highlighting, as again, Dr. Smith also mentioned this, looking at how to kind of identify GVC firms at the firm level and what potential robustness checks can be used there. That's a point I take very seriously, and that should be okay. Looking at issues around TFP robustness. So that's an interesting point. And I think in the paper, or maybe in this paper or some other paper, which is basically using the same set of TFP estimates that I've done, I do look at it, I construct TFP from using the annual survey of industries data in different industries, and I sort of compare the two with the prowess estimates of TFP that I've obtained using my methodology, as well as the sort of productivity estimates from ASI data, the industry level, to see if there are significant variations. And I do see that they're very similar estimates. So that I've sort of used as a robustness, not necessarily a robustness check in the econometric models, but more in generally to see if the TFP estimates are in line. But yes, of course, there are issues around value added function, but then there are also issues around the output function. So they have their own sort of caveats in terms of both. The point around, I think the clarifications I'm happy to make, I think this point around the matching year to industry. So I agree, actually, I spoke to we were speaking with Professor Golda recently about it, and I read his paper where he actually has matched from year to industry. That's definitely a much better and a more sort of robust way of matching. If I remember correctly, at the time I was doing this, I think one of the reasons why I have not done by industries, because it was leading to a loss of common support in my case for the time period that I was considering. And so it was sort of like a call to be made whether we lose more common support or we kind of stick, have more common support, but then kind of include industry dummies in the model itself. But I take the point of kind of perhaps making a caveat there that the better approach is to, of course, match by industry as well. I think, yeah, that's about it. And I've noted down most of the comments, and I'm happy to kind of take them forward and perhaps also have, individual discussions with some of you as I kind of work on this more.
So we have a few minutes left. So if anybody has any question, then please raise it now. Satyaki, you're mute. You're mute. Satyaki, you're mute.
I think I'm audible now.
Yeah.
Okay. First of all, thank you, Dr. Karishma, for this wonderful paper. And what I would say that the key conclusion that we have drawn and established rigorously is that the farms which are included in the global production network in India have a higher total factor productivity compared to other farms in similar industry. Now, this is well taken, but also one can say earlier the kind of literature used to argue that the farms which are related to exports, they have a greater productivity than those who are linked with the domestic market. So establishing that using quantitative techniques is itself commendable. But I would also say that when you are drawing conclusions, and if the question is whether this can be a strategy to argue that this kind of a global production network or integrating with the global production network actually increases your productivity as a process, in the sense that if you use a dynamic framework, whether this productivity increase will keep on going or not. And there I would say that if someone argues that those farms who are linked with global production network, if they have higher productivity compared to the domestic farms, the more important question in the global market is whether the growth of productivity in these farms is faster than other farms who are in this industry in the global market. See, the question is that whether you would be able to survive in the global market or not does not depend only on whether you have a higher productivity than the domestic farms in the same industry. If it is a global production network, whether the apex farms and the large multinational companies will move from India to Vietnam would depend upon whether the productivity growth in India is keeping pace with the growth of productivity in the industry as a whole in the the global market. So I think that is more important rather than whether we have a higher productivity than the domestic farms or not. Why I am saying this? Because if you want to see in a dynamic process, then the question would come is the issue of technology. And since technologies are more or less propertied, and here the competition through which we survive is basically on the basis of cheap labor, but the labor cost is low, so this relocation is happening. So there is a limit to this kind of productivity growth, because if the technology in the north is propertied and we are having a competition within the global south, then the value added on the basis of which you are calculating total factor productivity is going to decline over a period of time, if we are not able to keep pace with the growth of productivity in the industry as a whole. The second point which I want to mention is this, that if this relocation is happening, whether in the form of FDI or what Professor Devanathan has mentioned is basically arm's length kind of relationship within the value chain, if that is happening, in the case of India, it is basically in middle skilled industries, not in the labor intensive industries. It is not happening in leather, it is not happening in garments, but you will find more global integration in electricity, appliances, in chemicals, in engineering industries. So these are the segments which are relatively labor intensive in the global north, but they are capital intensive in global south. So not necessarily integration would also lead to greater employment, or the way we can usually draw the conclusion that if you get integrated, then we get the advantage of employment because capital would come to more labor intensive industries. This has not happened in case of India. So you can take these two things in your future work. That's all.
It's already about 5:30, so maybe we can take one or two more questions and then Dr. Karishma can respond. If there is no other question, then Dr. Karishma, would you like to respond?
Yeah. Thank you, Satyaki. I think that's two very excellent points, I think. So if I get it right, I think your point, the first point is more around not just focusing on productivity, but looking at, let's say, market survival of the Indian firm in the global markets, and also looking at then the sort of productivity gap that you see between sort of the superstar firms and the more laggard firms, right? So I think, and then going back, I think to Professor Nathan's point also around the profit margin. So I think in this specific paper, I'm looking at productivity as the sort of main outcome variable, just to kind of look at economic upgrading strategies in value chains. But I take the point that for developing countries, perhaps these are the outcomes that also matter equally, if not more, is to look at the survival of these firms. So I think that makes for a very interesting future paper as well, as a separate topic. And I think around your issue, I totally agree with you that, you know, integration into these value chains does not necessarily guarantee sort of employment gains. And I think, in fact, some of my own work previously suggested, and this is a, you know, an old paper, I think in 2016, that I was looking at sort of participation of India in value chains and how that is impacting employment gains. And if I remember correctly, I actually found the opposite, because it was only that the forward linkages were having a positive and significant impact, whereas the backward linkages were, you know, in fact, having the substitution impact on employment. So yeah, I take that point, and I think it's interesting to sort of look at this, you know, three-way interaction between technology, value chains, and then sort of the outcome variable, whether that's employment or whether that's market survival. So yeah, I completely agree, and I think those are very important recommendations and suggestions to take forward as well. So thank you for those.
So we will wind up today's session. Thank you all. Thank you for participating.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for the comments and feedback.